settle in, because this one begins with a man's hair, which sounds like a peculiar place to begin a story, and yet, there it is. One autumn morning, Dr. Watson arrived at Baker Street to find his friend Sherlock Holmes already deep in conversation with a visitor. And what a visitor he was. A large, stout gentleman of middle years, with a face full of worry and a head, oh, that head, blazing with the most extraordinary flame-red hair you could possibly imagine. Copper and fire and autumn leaves all at once. Holmes introduced him as Mr. Jabez Wilson, a pawnbroker from Saxe-Coburg Square. Watson could see the man was troubled. His thick hands twisted at his hat brim, and his eyes had that particular look, the look of someone who has been made to feel very foolish indeed, and cannot quite work out how it happened. Holmes leaned forward in his armchair, fingers pressed together, eyes bright with quiet delight. He loved this part, the beginning of things. Jabez Wilson cleared his throat and produced a folded newspaper clipping. A small advertisement, yellowed at the edges. It announced the existence of something called the Red-Headed League, a charitable organization founded by an American eccentric of great wealth, devoted entirely to the welfare and employment of men blessed with red hair. And the pay, £4 a week, for doing almost nothing at all. Wilson had been brought to it by his young assistant, a quick, clever fellow named Vincent Spaulding. Spaulding had seemed almost more excited about the opportunity than Wilson himself, which, in hindsight, was perhaps a clue worth noticing. The work was simple. Wilson sat in a small office each weekday morning and had copied out the Encyclopedia Britannica by hand, word for word, letter for letter, starting right at the beginning with the A's. For 8 weeks he did this, quite contentedly. And then, one morning he arrived to find the office locked. A small card pinned to the door. 4 words. The League is dissolved. Just like that. Gone. Before Wilson had finished his tale, Holmes had already begun reading him. The way a musician hears a piece before the first note is fully struck. He glanced at Wilson's hands, his coat sleeves, the calluses, the tan line at his wrist. He noted the small white splash of acid on the man's forefinger, a pawnbroker's mark. He remarked, quite casually, that Wilson had done manual labor in his youth, had been in China, and had recently written a great deal. Wilson stared. Watson smiled. He had seen this 100 times, and it still felt like a small miracle. Holmes explained himself, briefly, almost impatiently. The details were obvious, if you knew where to look. But then his voice shifted. He grew quiet, thoughtful. The Red-Headed League, he said softly, was not what it appeared to be. The advertisement, the generous wages, the peculiar insistence that Wilson attend in person every single morning, all of it had one purpose: to keep Jabez Wilson away from his own shop. That afternoon, Holmes and Watson walked to Saxe-Coburg Square. It was a quiet, slightly shabby little pocket of London, 4 rows of dingy brick houses, a patch of weedy garden in the center, the smell of damp stone and old leather. Wilson's pawn shop sat on one corner, its 3 golden balls hanging above the door. Holmes stood outside a long while, saying nothing. He tapped the pavement with his walking stick, slow and deliberate, thinking thoughts Watson could not quite follow. Then he rang the bell of the pawn shop and asked the young man who answered, Vincent Spaulding, sharp-eyed, quick-smiled, for directions to the Strand. The directions were given. The door closed. Holmes turned and walked briskly away. Watson hurried after him. "What are we looking for?" he asked. Holmes glanced back at the shop front. He had noticed, he said, that Spaulding's trousers were worn at the knees, considerably worn, as if the man had spent a great deal of time kneeling on hard ground. They rounded the corner, and Holmes stopped dead. There, backing directly onto Wilson's pawn shop, separated from it only by a thin wall and the width of a man's ambition, was the City and Suburban Bank. Holmes looked at Watson. Watson looked at Holmes, and then they both understood. The encyclopedias, the mornings, the red hair, all of it, every elaborate piece of the puzzle, had been constructed around one simple objective: to dig a tunnel. Spaulding, who Holmes quickly identified as John Clay, a notorious and brilliantly dangerous criminal, had been burrowing beneath the pawnshop floor for weeks. Each morning, when Wilson trotted off to his little office to copy out his A's and B's, Clay and his confederate went underground, patient as moles, inching toward the bank vault. The Red-Headed League was never a charity. It was a distraction. A magnificent, absurd, gloriously audacious distraction. Holmes almost admired it. Almost. He sent word to the bank manager and to Inspector Jones at Scotland Yard. "Tonight," he said, "we spring the trap." That night, the four of them crept into the bank after closing. Holmes, Watson, Inspector Jones, and the bank manager himself. A pale and frightened man who kept mopping his forehead. They descended to the stone cellar and settled in to wait. No light, no sound but the faint drip of water somewhere in the dark and the slow percussion of their own breathing. Watson gripped his revolver. The minutes stretched like taffy. Holmes sat perfectly still beside him, calm as a cat. Then, a sound, a scrape, a crack of pale light in the floor. A stone slab shifted and a hand appeared, then a head, then a slim young man pulled himself up out of the earth like something born from it. He had a lantern and a quick, cold smile. Clay. He reached back for his confederate, and then Holmes struck, fast and certain as a hawk. Jones had Clay's wrists before he drew his next breath. The confederate scrambled back down into the tunnel, only to be caught at the other end. It was over in moments. Back at Baker Street, long after midnight, the fire had burned low and comfortable. Watson poured out the brandy. Holmes sat stretched in his chair, looking faintly pleased. That rare and quiet expression he wore when the world had resolved itself correctly. Clay was in custody. The bank vault untouched. Wilson would keep his shop none the worse. Holmes remarked that it was, in its own way, a beautiful scheme. The Red-Headed League. What a thing to have invented. What patience it required. What imagination. The criminal mind, he said, when it reaches a certain pitch of ingenuity, becomes almost indistinguishable from the artistic. Almost. Watson laughed softly. Outside, London murmured on, indifferent and enormous. But here, in this warm lamplit room, the evening felt complete, contained, safe. That is what Holmes gave to the world, Watson thought. Not just the catching of villains, but the reassurance that the darkness, however clever, could be read, could be understood, could be brought, blinking, into the light. Sleep well now. Sleep well.